So now we're going to talk about the impression formation process. And basically what that is a process in which you perceive another person, so your perception of them, and develop evaluations or interpretations of them. We're going to talk about a couple of We're going to talk about 6 influences on impression formation. So 6 things or 6 ways that influence how you perceive other people. So the first is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what this means is you make a prediction about how a person's going to behave or how a situation's going to do. And then you act towards that person or towards that situation as if your previous prediction were true. And because you act as if it is true, it becomes true, and then that reinforces your belief. So a common self-fulfilling prophecy is this. You assume that you're going to do bad on a test, so because that prediction is true, you don't study for the test. You act as if it were true. And then you go in, you take the test, you don't do well, and that just reinforces your belief that if you think you're going to do bad on a test, you actually do bad on a test. And that's exactly what happens. So self-fulfilling prophecy, you prophesy that something's going to happen and it comes true because you start acting in a way that it already is true. So kind of a dangerous thing to get into, but we do it all the time. The next is something called implicit personality theory. And this is basically a system of rules that tell you which characteristics of a person go with other characteristics of a person. So it's a little bit confusing in your textbook, but I do think it's somewhat interesting on page 68 to look at the middle there, where it tries to see if you can match the third attribute of a person with the other two. So one is Kim is bold, defiant, and then you have a choice of extroverted and introverted. Well, most of us would choose extroverted because we assume that somebody who's bold and defiant is also extroverted. So it just seems like it fits because characteristics go together that are like-minded. So bold and defiant, it just goes with extroverted. It doesn't matter if truly Kim is introverted, we just assume that she is extroverted. And then there's 2 different effects that go with this. The first is the halo effect. And this is just a function of implicit personality theory in that when you believe that a person has positive qualities, you assume they have more positive qualities that you have yet to figure out. So if they have one positive quality, you are certain that there are more positive qualities that you're going to find out. Often this is what happens when we first meet somebody who we're attracted to. We have a nice conversation with them. They're very funny. And so we say, well, gosh, if they're funny, they must be generous and kind and loving and encouraging. And you start to put all these other qualities on this person just because you observed one positive quality. And then there's the reverse halo effect, which is basically the opposite. And this is if you believe a person has one negative quality, you're more likely to believe they have other negative qualities. So you meet somebody, your first impression of them is that they are very self-centered. You will assume then that they are self-centered, they are rude, they are selfish, and they are very tight-fisted with their money. Negative attributes go with other negative attributes, and positive attributes go with other positive attributes. The third is the perceptual accentuation, and that's what you see, what you expect to see, or what you want to see. And most of us can say that if we're looking for something, we're probably going to see it. So, for example, if I believe that my husband is very flirtatious, and we go to a business function, and during that business function, he talks to several women, and I'm just looking for something that he does to be the catalyst for me to get upset with him, I'm probably going to be saying to myself, well, he flirts with people all the time, so I'll just look for that. And then what do you think I'm going to see the second he talks to a female coworker? I'm going to see exactly that because I was looking for it. So you have to be careful that sometimes you're only going to see what you want to see instead of truly what is occurring. The next one is the primacy recency theories. Primacy tells us that you're going to believe what comes first, or what happens first is going to exert more influence. So your first impression, that's where that comes from. Your first impression is following the theory of primacy, which means we hold on to that which we hear or learn first. Recency is the opposite, and that's what comes last exerts the most influence. So oftentimes we'll say, what have you done for me lately? It's the example your book uses, and basically what that means is recently, what have you done? Nothing. It doesn't matter if the first thing you ever did for me was nice. You haven't done anything today, so it doesn't matter what you say. You're not the person who I thought you were. And the first impression is likely to be the most important, and you tend to filter other additional information through that first impression. So that's the other way that primacy holds a little bit more weight than recency. Consistency is the tendency to maintain balance among perceptions. So you expect certain things to go together and other things not to go together. You expect people that you like to have positive characteristics and people who you don't like to have negative ones. The other thing that your textbook does on the bottom of page 69 is it does give you some more sentences, and they want you to respond to them. And then it says at the bottom what it would be. And I think the one that we most refer to, or the one that most occurs in our life, is number 4. I expect my friend to like or dislike my enemy. We assume that if we have a friend and we have an enemy, that if we tell that friend about our enemy, they will immediately dislike that enemy. However, you know that there's plenty of situations in which you dislike somebody and then your friend decides, well, she's not so bad, I'm going to be friends with her anyways. And we are so taken back because that violates the theory of consistency in perception. Last but not least is the attribution of controllability. We tend to dislike people if they were in control of negative behaviors. So if we know, for example, somebody was hammered, they were wasted, they didn't care, and they got behind the wheel and drove, we're not going to think kindly about them. We're going to just think they're a loser. But if somebody's husband just left them, or somebody's wife just died, and they get behind the wheel and drive after they've had a couple of glasses of wine, we're going to say, you know, something terrible just happened to them, and I don't think it was really her fault. Her husband just left her. Or it wasn't really his fault. His wife just died. And so we're going to sympathize with them if they weren't in control, if there were these external kind of factors that played into it. And then there's 3 attribution errors that fall under the attribution of control. And those are the first, self-serving bias, which means usually we'll take credit for our positive behaviors, but we deny the negative behaviors. So if somebody says, you know, you're so nice, we have no problem saying, you're right, I am very nice. But if somebody says, you're very selfish, we say, what are you talking about? I am not. I'm a very nice person. I am never selfish, which isn't true because we're all selfish at a certain point in life. The next is the over-attribution. And that's where we focus on 1 or 2 characteristics of a person and we attribute everything else to these 2 attributes, or this one attribute. And that can be problematic because normally we're going to make errors based on that. But for example, if I know somebody who is a good father and they're also a good neighbor, I could start to say, you know, that guy, there's no problem with him. He's a great guy. He's a great neighbor. I heard he's a great dad. I just really like him. But if somebody tells me, you know, he's embezzling money from his employer, I would say, no, he couldn't be doing that because he's a good father and he's a great neighbor. Well, that's over-attribution. He could very well be doing those things. It doesn't mean that he's not a good father. It doesn't mean that he's not a good neighbor. What it means is he's doing something illegal that he should be obviously caught and reprimanded for. And then last but not least is the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to overvalue the contributions of internal factors. Internal factors are who somebody is. So what we do is we overvalue who somebody is, and what we undervalue is external factors. And that means what's going on in their life and how that affects who they are. So we tend to believe that is just who that person is. The reason why that person did that is because they are mean-spirited and bitter because they haven't had a good life. when really what it is it's these external factors of the fact that maybe they lost a promotion to somebody who was being sneaky and lying and kind of going behind the boss's back, and their wife just died from a terrible car accident. And these external factors is what's causing this person to appear bitter and mean-spirited, but we don't care about the external factors. All we care about is this guy's just a jerk. It's who he is. It's the internal factors. I'm not even going to take into account the external factors. And that can be somewhat unfair when trying to understand people and evaluate who do we think they are. So we're going to talk about increasing your perception accuracy and ways you can go about doing that. And so the first thing that you want to do is you want to analyze your impressions. That means subject your perceptions to logical analysis. Use critical thinking to analyze the impressions that you're making. And first and foremost, you have to recognize your role, that you are the one that's deciding what that impression is, and you're subjective. You can't be objective because you are who you are, and you take your scripts and your schematas and you make those part of your impressions of people. And the other thing you need to do is check your perceptions. That means that you should describe to people what you think is happening. Descriptions are things like, I think that I've been noticing you spending more time on your computer late at night. That is a description. A judgment is, you're such a slacker for being on your computer all the time. You don't even care about me. That's a judgment. Meaning you're a slacker is much different than saying to somebody, I think what I'm noticing is this. So make sure that you're careful to describe, not judge. And then next is seek confirmation about what you think is happening. And that means that you ask the other person if your description is accurate. Don't mind read. You cannot possibly come up with the thoughts and feelings of another person just from observing their behavior. So be very, very careful with that. And then you're going to want to reduce your uncertainty. And that means you can use certain strategies to observe the other person in an active setting. You can also collect information by asking others about that person, and then you have to interact with them. So observing the other person is going to be important. Collecting information from other people and then interacting with that individual are 3 ways that you can reduce your certainty. And then you're going to increase your cultural sensitivity, which is following up just to chapter 2. You know how to do that. Educate yourself. That was one of the tips we learned about that other person or that other culture. Recognize that you're different, and those differences are just that, differences. They're not right or wrong. And then confront your stereotypes and say, I believe that all people are this way, but this person is an individual, and just because they're part of that culture doesn't mean they're necessarily going to behave in that stereotypical way. And then last but not least, you're going to want to adjust your communication based on what you've learned about that culture, what you know about how to effectively communicate with members from another culture.